President Xi Jinping have delivered a speech in the G20 meeting, and he emphasized the importance of multilateralism and openness and cooperate between the G20 members, and that's the only way to get a sustainable development of the world economy. So, what's your opinion about his speech?
Thank you again. Yes, I listened to Mr. Xi's statement. I think it was one of the most influential statements in the G20 leaders summit, because he correctly mentioned about specific terms which we consider today are very vital, important for the governance of world economy. In his speech, and the title was Looking Beyond the Horizon and Steering the World Economy in the Right Direction. Yes, and for this right direction, he emphasized very correct terms like openness, especially concerning the difficulties with respect to the multilateralism, multilateral structure of the world economy, which is actually becoming very much poisoned by some unilateral actions which do not help countries, the G20 and other countries. These are some short-term reactions, responses, which even do not help those countries which implement them. So we need multilateral rules. If we have some deficiencies in the multilateral system, then we have to reform it. And Mr. Xi was very right in his opinion for reforming the WTO, that I can mention a bit later in more detail. But the term openness is important. The second important thing he mentioned was partnership. This is something also we require very urgently, because as you remember, G20 was a product of a post-crisis period where all leading economies in the world, whether advanced or emerging economies, were trying to find solutions to the very big crisis affecting the world economy, the economic and financial crisis. And it helped a lot. And we experienced that this partnership was quite important to have a coordinated action, especially with respect to implementing policies, complementary policies like fiscal, monetary, and other structural reforms. That was the second point he mentioned very clearly and very rightly. The third point is important to my belief, not only for advanced but especially for developing and emerging economies, innovation. And this, just consider we are going to live in the couple of decades in a world that we can not even consider. Maybe our children will be living in a much technological world, but we need to make some investment for technology, for innovation, for the humanity. And this is an important vision that he put. I remember this vision was very much high on the agenda of China presidency in 2016. And later, in the last 2 years, I saw that this innovation concept was a bit blurred and lost its ambience. But thanks to Mr. Xi's statement, he again reminded us that this innovation is quite important, that we should not forget. The fourth point he mentions, also this was one of the important concepts during the Turkey's and Chinese presidencies in 2015 and 16 consecutive years, that inclusiveness. And two countries are the emerging economies, and that represents a high growth rate, especially with respect to China. And they mention about this inclusiveness in a very correct way, because we need to have a much equity and justice in terms of global development, that this development should be somehow diffused into many parts of the world economy. Otherwise, just a growth in certain parts of the globe will not be sufficient. And I think he correctly chose these concepts in his statement. And gave us some visionary idea of what to do. My opinion is that under these concepts, maybe G20 can just reframe itself to bring a much influential role for this forum to be able to cope with the problems, the challenges that we face today. And statement therefore should not remain as a just formal statement, that other G20 members should also consider them as something very specific and put there in a very correct way.
Yeah, and maybe we can say more about the innovation part that he emphasized. And because we know the innovation is maybe the engine of the economic to develop. So maybe you can have more views on this innovation part.
Yes, we are in a time of technological development, and we have the humanity is now developing many different technological tools that help our lives to become much easier. And who are going to invent them, and who is going to boost the investment in innovation? Especially the G20 countries are the main players in that field. But this area is not only reserved to advanced economies, but countries like China and others which are developing fast and which are growing fast. And innovation is an important source of growth, first of all. But this growth can be converted into a social development if we can just implement them in a proper way. And in that sense, innovation also is and also the digital economy is becoming an important part of our life. So this is one aspect of the issue. When we have a digital transformation through which we have e-commerce, digital trade, but this helps countries to diffuse this technological development to other parts of the world. And I think he mentioned very correctly two concepts here under innovation. The first one is to boost education and vocational training, because technology is important, but sometimes not very easy to capture by people of what we mean by innovation or technology. And therefore, education of ordinary people, the public, is quite important, that they should be able to read and understand and how to utilize technology well. It's not only reserved to researchers or scientists, but also for general people. And therefore, training is also important. The second aspect is the spread of these new technologies and knowledge, that's knowledge diffusion, which I think would be also helpful for the parts of the world, other countries. I think China, in that case, in this sense, is having a very strong role. I know in China the patent rights are increasing, and technological investment is very high, and this will also help not only China but also other countries through this diffusion, which President Xi, I think, in his statement tries to explain. And therefore I see Chinese role, the role of China, very much pivotal in this sense. And maybe it's providing global public good in that sense. And I remember some assaults on China of not protecting the intellectual property rights, but if you invest in technology, you respect the property rights. And I think in that sense China is also developing, and that will help China to clearly put its vision. And I think the unilateral action by US and others attacking on China will be nonsense in the very near future.
Yeah, and As we know, President Erdogan and President Xi met last night and they talked about some cooperation between Turkey and China and also emphasize the initiative of One Belt, One Road with benefit for all. So maybe you can give us more view on the two countries' cooperation.
Yes, especially the years when Turkey delivered its presidency to China, it was a period where we had a very good institutional cooperation. And I think this, I see no reason that we should stop this and we can continue this cooperation, and we must actually, because China is growing high, it's a big market, and especially Mr. Xi's opening of the market to other countries that we mentioned last time about the recent fair, increasing imports and making the Chinese economy more open to others in terms of investment is quite important for Turkey, because from Turkish perspective we are too much linked to Europe. That's good, but we need to reform our customs union and economic link with the European Union. But at the same time, Turkey should consider growing markets, especially China. And I think in that sense, in Turkey's economy and trading patterns, China should have a much clear and bigger position, not only in imports but also for Turkish exports, because it's a growing economy and market, and the per capita income of Chinese people is increasing. That will also be very attractive for Turkish firms in China, to operate in China, and maybe to have more joint ventures in China. We should also have much deeper research and understanding, and maybe Turkey should make more investment in researching about China. We need really strong centers to study more on China in the universities, in research institutes, in think tanks like TEPAV. Secondly, the Belt and Road Initiative. I believe it's a very important proactive international cooperation area which very much fits with the objectives put forward by Mr. Xi Jinping in his statement in the G20 summit. This initiative provides infrastructural investment, and from Turkish point of view, I believe this will help improve infrastructural system in Turkey, especially in terms of transportation and communication, which will also help Turkey to bring more development in less developed areas, like in the eastern part of Turkey. So this is a kind of, I see this as a kind of mechanism or opportunity to boost development and provide a much equitable development level also in the countries in the region through the infrastructural investments. Another area of cooperation, we always mention about innovation and technology. I think this should be also improved by conducting bilateral and joint research activities between Chinese and Turkish scientists, which I believe would also help in the future both economies to produce new innovative products, systems, and processes.
Thank you very much. And I think you make your point very clearly.
There is one important point which I see very important, because for the summit it was one of the hot issues, is the trade issue. We talked about multilateralism, and let me say a few words about it, because otherwise this summit it will be a lacking point. Multilateral system has been very beneficial for all the countries. So in his statement, I agree with Mr. President's idea that we still need open markets, non-discrimination, and WTO principles. Non-discrimination is quite important, and also why we established WTO was to reduce, to prevent barriers to trade. But trading system is becoming more complex, trading processes are becoming more complex, and countries in time start legislating some acts which sometimes does not help trade. And these barriers should also be eliminated. But we need new rules. We need rules that fit the 21st century trade. And we need to make the WTO back to the center. Otherwise, any erosion in the WTO system will not help countries like China, not even to US, because US actually grew thanks to open markets. That's also a case for our countries. Now, this trade wars, or what people call it as trade wars, we don't need ammunition or weapons, but these are also giving a big harm on the global economy. So this happened actually between US and other countries and becoming more bilateral between US and China. And the US action against China by raising tariffs for a very significant part of bilateral trade is very dangerous. For not only for US economy, if you look at from the classical economic point of view, but also China, but also third countries, because we have the global value chains which actually add up countries' economies to each other in connected economies and production systems. If you ever hit Chinese firms, that means you also hit other Asian firms, countries, or some other countries, or any investor, whether Turkish investor or American investor in Far East Asia. So it's not very easy to target in that case countries. The second important issue in the trade war is the national security concern. I think this is a concept which is very much easily abused or which is misused. I remember dumping issue was one of the unfairness or unfair trade practices like dumping was one of the hot issues in 1980s towards Japan and Korea. Same thing is now happening to China under these national security things. But this unilateral aggressive action by the United States has not worked during 1980s. And I think it will not work today for the global trade and bilateral trade. But the case is even much worse today because in 1980s the world economy was not so much interconnected. Today we have an interconnected economy, a production system, supply chains and other. So I think its economic cost will be even much higher. And therefore we need the G20, and therefore we need a reform of WTO in that context to restore the erosion of WTO system. So the world economy, the cost of the protectionist measures diminish, and so we don't need any more such aggressive unilateral actions which will not even help to those who implement them. And this is my view, and I think the ideas from Mr. Xi in terms of openness and restoring the multilateral trading system was very much right.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot from your
It's my pleasure actually to talk about these, but still we are going in a process, in a time where really G20, if you look from point of view of the summit results, I don't know whether we are going to have a summit communique even, but this will be a missed opportunity if we don't have it. But I believe that we need multilateral processes and G20, and this is the reason why we need forums like this. We need cooperation, partnership, and that was emphasized by the president. I think he understands the the real value of G20 process, the summit, and his presence in the summit, yeah, in that sense, especially his visionary ideas are quite important for the coming years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Maybe we do ask other